Hello everybody and welcome to another online lesson. Today we're going to look at the satellite states and their impact on the Grand Alliance. This is nobody's favourite topic. It's really quite dry, but important to understand how it's adding to the tensions of the post-World War II conferences. So it really is a bit of a turning point, and in support of this breakdown of the alliance as we start getting towards the first Berlin crisis and so on with the arms race, it's important to see how this plays a part in the story, in how it looks to the US and how it looks to the Soviet Union, what's happening on both sides of the Atlantic. So let's get straight into it with a little bit of backstory, some context to the satellite states. So firstly, the war is over. Hitler's killed himself. The Grand Alliance is on relatively good terms. Potsdam was fairly good, apart from a couple of disagreements here and there. Obviously, there's a little bit of tension coming with the Americans testing the bomb in Potsdam and not telling Stalin, and obviously Truman coming along. A little bit of a different kind of relationship between America and Russia under Truman than it was under Roosevelt. But then after the war, the United States obviously then dropped 2 nuclear bombs on Japan. So that's starting to strain the Grand Alliance significantly. Again, Stalin may start to feel a little bit paranoid. Again, poor communication from Truman in this alleged team. All sorts of reasons why these might start just straining things a little bit. So let's get on a little bit more as to what's happened in between World War II ending and the satellite states being created. So Winston Churchill, who lost the election, as we know, during World War II, and was replaced by Attlee. He goes over to America in 1946 and delivers this Iron Curtain speech. All right, so we've already talked about this in a previous lesson, but what that essentially does is it talks about how Europe is split east and west. But if there was any doubt of Churchill's allegiance, if you like, it's clear he's in pro-American side here, because this speech took place in America, which, to be fair, is our traditional ally anyway. But Stalin took this as a little bit of a slight from Churchill. As well as that, we've also had our 2 telegrams that we've previously done in last lesson as well, where basically America's writing back to home saying that the Soviets are planning this big spread of communism. And then from Washington, Novikov sends a telegram back to Moscow saying that the Americans are building this huge army. And why would you need this massive army in peacetime? So paranoia is rising up quite significantly. Lots of things are going on. And then in March 12th, 1947, Truman delivers this Truman Doctrine. It's probably the first threat, if you like, first real sign of aggression of the Cold War so far. So the Truman Doctrine has definitely put some wind in the sails of this alliance breaking down. Okay, so now that we've got this sort of little backstory in place, we can start thinking about these satellite states. So in 1947, or by 1947, a couple of Eastern European countries seem to have fallen to communism, if you look at it through the eyes of Truman, or at the very least become pro-Soviet. So before we look into how each country fell, it's a fairly straightforward lesson in that sense, just a little bit boring. Let's have a little think about what the message of this image is, okay? So maybe pause the video if you're watching this for the first time, and if you're watching this as revision for Year 11, then maybe you remember we talked about this in class. What is it trying to say? What's the message of this video, of this picture trying to say? And then when you're ready, unpause, and I'll tell you and see if you are correct. All right, so welcome back. So this video, this picture is essentially trying to show you that as a grapple, there's a tug of war going on. That's what the rope is trying to insinuate. And we've got these 2 circles of influence, or spheres of influence. We'll use that term throughout this Cold War course. So what I'm trying to show you really essentially is, if you look at the countries around these circles, is that America and Russia are essentially fighting to try and influence these countries. So we can see words around the image like capitalism, support, security, freedom, protection, communism, and equality. They're the kind of main words framing both sides' views of this post-war world. We can see in the France, Greece, Italy, and Western Europe, they obviously more naturally ally to the West, and then you've got the Eastern European countries. So both sides are essentially trying to grapple with all these countries to win their support for their side, which is essentially a little bit what is being implied or said by Winston Churchill in his little Iron Curtain speech. So that's what the image or message is trying to portray. So let's work our way through this lesson now and just see how each country falls or is taken over, or however it might look, but also keeping into perspective, how does it look from both sides? Remember, Stalin is talking about protection. America is worried about spreading. All right, so that's where we are as we go on. So why did Stalin create these satellite states in Eastern Europe? All right. So this image here shows Stalin fighting the Nazis, a little bit of a Photoshop mishap. Basically, the Soviet army has freed Eastern Europe from the Nazis. So in Stalin's mind, he believes he should influence them, obviously not control them. But this was agreed at the World War II conference, remember, that there could be some influence in Eastern Europe, but Churchill was always concerned that it would become control. All right, a couple of years in, and it seems to be that Churchill might have been right all along. But at least from the perspective of Stalin, he believes he should have some influence there because he helped defeat the Nazis. When the war was over, Stalin was reluctant to give up his control and then starts using the term buffer zone. Or certainly that's what it became known as, a bit of a buffer zone between Germany and the Soviet Union. He is basically talking in protectionist terms to try and say he's protecting Russia from any further invasions. Okay, so let's not forget that there's been wars on two fronts and the Eastern Front for World War I and World War II in recent years. So in that sense, again, you could possibly see where Stalin's coming from. All right, so he says, you see, having freed much of Europe from the Nazis, it's only right that I remain in control of these countries. It'll be sensible, of course, for these countries to elect communist governments that can be supported by Moscow. So I'm essentially implying there by writing that is not a direct quote of Stalin, that he wants to control Eastern European countries, whereas the West and what was agreed in the Grand Alliance or by the Grand Alliance, that they could be some influence but not control. This is where the paranoia starts. Now, don't forget, we've had the satellites, the telegrams by this point, so what both sides think is happening is heavily influenced by what these two telegrams have said. Okay, so what is a satellite state? That's what this little image was. If we were doing this in class, I might give you a little starter activity or some time to work this out. It just means satellite states, okay? So United States and a satellite. The gist of what this is basically you've got Moscow and you've got all of these countries like satellites around Moscow, like a satellite might go around the Earth. So Stalin has set these things up for this little buffer zone. These states become communist and were controlled by Moscow, essentially. So although they are independent countries, they are told what to do by Moscow. This is why Truman was incredibly anxious, and as was Churchill in the early conferences, that he wanted there to be free elections. And you remember there was some tension at Potsdam about these elections becoming free and absolutely being democratic. Truman was worried about the Soviets being able to build this massive force, which would then help them move west. That's, I guess, the point of the Truman Doctrine. So Truman says here, see, just what I thought. Evidence that you want to spread communism worldwide. The tension is getting almost unbearable. Who do you think you are, Stalin? So hopefully you can see now, just with a bit of context and the last lesson on the telegrams, that tension is high. The Grand Alliance is definitely teetering on the brink here. And then Stalin responds, you're paranoid, you idiot. These elections are free. Okay, maybe a bit of pressure from Moscow, maybe. But just take over the world. Ha, I just want to protect the USSR from your domination plans. So although this is a bit ad-libbing and I'm putting words into both of these presidents' mouths for you in this lesson, I'm just trying to give you some idea about what they're thinking about each other. And of course, as we keep saying, the telegrams are critical for this, as they have fed both of these sides with this kind of threat from both sides. It might be worth taking a little bit of a pause in the video here just to see what you think as a historian, really. Who is to blame for this current crisis in the Grand Alliance? Are they both as bad as each other? What do you think? Just as a little interest, really. When you do that, if you want to do that, we just carry on with the video. Just press on pause. Okay, so how might the Soviet Union influence or take over a country? Just write down in your book, on your Google Doc, or however you're doing this, all of the ways in which Stalin could influence or take over a country legally, almost, if you like. Bear in mind that the Western world is watching what he does. When you're ready, unpause, come back to the video, and we'll go through some of the possible ways that Stalin might be able to do this. All right, welcome back. So first of all, he could favour or support leaders with close links to the Soviet Union and to him. So friends, if you like, friends in high places. He could also arrange a coup or a takeover supported by the Red Army. Now, that would not look good, would it? To Truman on the West, that would absolutely make sure that it looked to America, at least, that the Soviets were aggressively spreading their communism across Europe, and would support the telegram. He could intimidate countries already on the brink, really. Remember, a lot of World War II, well, a lot of Europe has been destroyed by World War II, and that was always the worry about these countries going communist because they had nothing left to lose. So if the Red Army is already in there, so Poland comes to mind as a good country for this one, having freed them from the Nazis, they could intimidate in the elections, sort of maybe not so much rigged as such, but you know, it could be of an influence. They could remove leaders on trumped up criminal charges, so made up charges, replacing them with Soviet supporters. And they could emphasize the popular support for communism. They could take advantage of these ruins that most of Europe is in, saying how communism, you know, looks after everybody and everyone's equal and all of those things that desperate people might be interested in hearing. All right. And then obviously the obvious one that you could do is to rig elections. So if Stalin was to do any of these things to the West and to Truman, it would look like an expansion. It would look like they are spreading communism, which absolutely is what Churchill feared at the conferences, what Truman was worried about at Potsdam. This wouldn't just be about influence. This would have been about a total takeover. Okay, so with that in mind, and everything else we've talked about so far in the first 10 minutes of this lesson, let's slowly start working our way through these countries, okay? So you can, if you want, just write the lists of the countries and then write what we talk about or how they fall or how they become communist. If you've got a little map, you can annotate around the map. If you're watching this because you missed the lesson, then there'll be a Google Doc in your Google Classroom that will have this picture that you can then annotate around if you want to. So this is a summary of how all the countries fell. We're going to go through them sort of bit by bit with a little bit more background. But if you want to pause the video and very quickly just not jot down these details, summarize them in your own words, obviously, but they're quite short already. But that will give you a good idea of what's coming as we go through the rest of this video. Okay, when you're ready, unpause and we'll go through these countries, just adding a little bit extra detail to what you can see on this map here. Also, if you want to try and get yourself a bit more detail, even more detail than previously, again, pause the video and look at this. There's a lot more detail in this one, but there's a couple of tasks that you can do. Again, if you're watching this because you missed the lesson, this will be in the Google Classroom where you can highlight each of the bits of information, the numbers, what do they show? How does each country fall? Was it support with leaders and links to the USSR? Was it a coup? Was it rigged? And did they remove leaders? So much more detailed than perhaps we're going to talk about in this lesson. But definitely this would be an advisable thing to do, particularly if you are trying to get those higher levels. Okay, so try to understand exactly how each country has fallen. If you're Truman, that's what it looks like, fallen to communism, or if they've happily joined because they fancied being communist. And then obviously you'll have a whole lot more detail. Also, the boxes there, you can consider the chronology of how and when each country fell. If we ever get a question on this, perhaps a narrative, probably quite unlikely, but it's possible. In the grand scheme of write a narrative account about the breakdown of the Grand Alliance, this would definitely be one of the bullet points. You'll be able to get a lot to say in the paragraph about how each country fell and joined the satellite states. Okay, so let's now go on further. You look at this at your leisure, print this or copy this if you want, but this is a much more detailed sort of description of how each country fell. We'll touch on most of them as we go through this lesson, but in one place, that's quite a nice document to look at. All right, so firstly, let's start with Poland. So how you're doing this, if you just write Poland and then add a few bullet points, or if you're annotating your map, then feel free. So Stalin is saying, historically, we've been attacked through Poland. As a result, Poland needs to be friendly and communist to protect the USSR. It's all about security. That's what Stalin is trying to present. This is about protecting the Soviet Union, protecting Russia. Also, just maybe it might be useful if I was planning an expansion. Now, Poland is a massive country. It's integral to Europe. It's on the border of Central Europe, and obviously it's somewhere in between Central and Eastern. So absolutely, Poland is a significant country to control if you did have expansion as plans. Also, Stalin is correct that Poland has been the sort of gateway into attacking Russia throughout both wars. So that is essentially a little bit of a summary there on why Stalin wants to control Poland. If you don't understand that bit, then obviously let your teacher know, but that should hopefully be quite straightforward now. And then the backstory to Poland. In 1944, just as the war's coming to a bit of an end, there's what's called the Warsaw Uprising, the Poles' last stand, if you like. They fight back against the Nazis. Now, obviously, the Nazis crushed the rebellion, absolutely, which left Poland absolutely defenseless. Now, Warsaw being the capital, but the Soviets sort of stood on the touchline watching this sort of fight. They knew that the Nazis were losing. They knew they didn't have long left, so they didn't want to get involved in this fight. Obviously, to try and save resources, I guess, to save men. But the Soviets waited for the Nazis to beat Poland because that would then make it easier when the time comes to take over a battered and broken Poland. Now, many of you might think that's really clever. Obviously, Truman sees that as quite a sinister plot or ploy on Stalin's behalf. And that is essentially what happens. So once the war is over, or becoming obvious that the war is over, this battered, bruised, broken Poland is just a doddle for Stalin to take over. So then in January 1947, this is the first example of some rigged elections. Stalin invites all non-communists to Moscow for a meeting, and then they're arrested, leaving all the communists back home in Poland to win the election, which is totally rigged, isn't it? But here we are, there's the first country, January 1947. So we haven't quite got the Truman Doctrine yet, that's in March, but you can see how close that was to this Polish rigged election. There's no denying it. Stalin can say it's for defense all he wants, but the agreement was back at Yalta and Potsdam that Poland would be free democratic elections. Now, whatever you say, this is not free and it's not democratic. Okay, so the next country to think about would be Romania. Again, another one of those countries that was sort of taken over during the war by the Soviet Union to get rid of the Nazis, so they feel that they should have this influence there. So firstly, in March 1945, the Red Army intervened, putting pressure on the voters, which forced the King of Romania to appoint a communist government. So again, heavily influencing in this point, aren't we? The Soviets are definitely influencing what would be some sort of democracy. In November, so we've had a lot going on by 1946. It's been over a year, 18 months near enough since that new government was put in place. They have elections again, and the communists won 80% of the vote in Romania. Now, you might think that they've done well. Chances are there was a little bit of pressure on there, a little bit of influencing, shall we say. All right, so then by 1947, a new communist government had abolished the monarchy in Romania. So think about it for the first time as we go through this story. How does Truman feel about this? That's the second country. All right, Poland and Romania. Definitely some Soviet influence. So maybe write a little answer somewhere in your book or however you're doing your notes on this, how Truman is feeling. Hopefully it's going to be quite obvious to you, but keep in mind everything we've talked about in this lesson as well. The paranoia and concern is definitely growing, ramping up, in fact. So Romania's gone. The monarchy's gone in Romania. It's a communist country now. Then we move over to Hungary. Now, as we know, if you're watching this as Year 11, you know that Hungary is going to play a huge part in the Cold War story later on. For those of you watching this because you missed the lesson, then just keep in mind that Hungary will become vital later on. So, firstly, in Hungary, Rákosi, a communist politician, he takes control of the secret police. Now, Rákosi is going to become the leader of Hungary eventually. He's part of the Hungarian uprising in 1956. He's very hardline, he's very pro-Soviet, pro-Stalin, and he starts arresting and executing all of these political opponents, which puts even more influence from Moscow on Hungary. And it goes without saying that the elections, in inverted commas, in Hungary, they go as exactly as planned. So the election of 1947, he sees the communists winning quite easily. And then, to make matters even worse, all other parties have been banned. So very similar to the Nazi elections, isn't it, after they win in 1933. So Hungary, again, has fallen, another country to be fallen into the satellite states. Now, again, by this point, we've had the telegrams, we've had the Truman Doctrine. There's no doubt at all that Europe is absolutely split, and you can start to see what Churchill was talking about in his Iron Curtain speech. All right. So again, as we just did previously with Romania, how does Truman feel about Hungary? It's the same answer, isn't it? Each time he's getting angrier, he's getting more paranoid, more suspicious, more paranoid, which also leads to obviously more American response, which, as we know, in 1947, we're going to see the Marshall Aid flying through Europe, trying to persuade countries not to fall to communism. And then we'll have a bit of a Berlin issue as well, won't we, at the start of 1948. So this is all sort of happening around this time. Just to keep that into perspective. So let's move over to our next satellite state. As I say, this lesson's quite quick, quite straightforward, just if not a little bit boring. But it's important that you can try and get your head around how some of these countries fell. It's more important that you understand that there was Soviet influence in the riggings of them, pressure from the Red Army, stuff like that, because these things add to the tension. Okay, so it would be a question 3. How important were the satellite states for international relations or development of the Cold War? But it could be, as we said earlier, a really nasty narrative question. So Bulgaria then. So in 1944, late 1944, a communist-dominated government has been set up. So some semblance of democracy, I guess, but it's definitely heavy weighted towards the communism. In November 1945, there's then been another election victory, fully for the communists, but this one again was rigged. In 1946, the monarchy was abolished, and again, all of the parties banned. Totally, this goes against free elections, free and fair elections, but that's another monarchy being removed. You could argue another country heavily controlled by the Soviet Union. So again, you could argue that Truman is well within his rights to respond to what he sees going on in Eastern Europe. Then we have a slightly different sort of slant on this. Yugoslavia, they resist, they fight bravely. So their leader, Tito, is elected to be president. Tito went on to be a bit of a thorn in the side of Moscow for years. He just had no intention of taking orders from Moscow. So kind of in and out, half in, half out of the satellite states. Again, similarly, half in, half out of the Warsaw Pact when that's set up in 1955. So Yugoslavia is an odd one, but it does form its part in this buffer zone. As you can see by the maps that we started this lesson with, you can absolutely start to see how this is a protectionist thing, how this is a buffer zone. Now, there's one country that is leaving a massive hole currently in that buffer zone, and that will be the last country to fall, which we'll look at in a sec, being Czechoslovakia. All right, so Tito challenged Stalin further, by taking some of that Marshall Aid, which infuriated Stalin because Stalin banned all satellite states from taking the Marshall Aid, even though some of them did apply for it, and it was open to them as well. That was all part of the game, I think, by the USA to offer this money to all of Europe, including the East, but Stalin made it clear. So by Tito taking some of that money, he is just a bit of a nuisance to Stalin. All right, the Soviet Union never fully occupied Yugoslavia. But they're, as we've just said, still in the buffer zone. And Yugoslavia eventually will be split up into several countries that we have today in the eastern region. All right, so we've talked at length about how Truman feels about all these things. It shouldn't be too difficult for you, but it's just another country. So it looks like another country being taken over, which absolutely supports Truman's view that Russia are spreading communism across Europe. And it won't be long until it's West Europe, Italy, France, Britain, and so on. This also goes some way as to say why Truman absolutely will not be leaving West Berlin. All right, so keep that in mind as we get into the Berlin crisis, the first one. This stuff has been going on. If he leaves now, West Berlin, as it seems to be this huge Soviet expansion, then you can absolutely see why it was never going to happen. All right, so East Germany, speaking of East Germany, we know that at Yalta, it was agreed Germany would be split. Within the Soviet zone is East Germany, and of course Berlin is in there as well. So nothing's really changed there, we know that. But the USSR is going to control East Germany for the short term. As we know, it went on for a very long time, but that's because other things happened. So more importantly is our last country and the plug, if you like, into the buffer zone. This is the thing that plugs the gap, the hole that's left, is communism's already popular in Czechoslovakia. The biggest party in this coalition government is communist, and they control everything, the police, the armed forces. So it's no real sort of shock that Czechoslovakia becomes a satellite state. The shock probably is how it took so long, I guess. Now, we know, don't we, if you're watching this as a revision video, that Czechoslovakia will also have a little bit of a rebellion in a few years in 1968, but as it is, it's a very loyal country, very much communist, and remains that right up until the end. So in 1948, again, support from the Soviets, they used the army to seize full control in a coup, so an aggressive takeover of the rest of the country just to make it official. All right, many non-communists were arrested, and the foreign secretary Masaryk was murdered. So an aggressive act. Now, to Truman, this is the last straw. Czechoslovakia being taken over in such an aggressive way, with in mind everything else we've talked about in this lesson so far, you can absolutely see why the long telegram is proven correct in the eyes of Truman, at least. So that is where we are. They're the fall of each of the countries. You've obviously listened to this, me talking to you a little bit about it. You've got the map earlier on in the lesson showing you some extra details, but just try and get your head around the fall of the satellite states. It might be a good idea to do some flashcards on this. So each country on one side, a country on the other side, its story. Maybe even write a narrative account of the fall of each of them. Just try and get your head around as much as you can the story of each individual country. You'd never need to talk about every single one. You wouldn't have time to do that, and none of the questions lends itself to that in the Cold War paper. But for your own confidence on what is essentially quite a boring and kind of random topic in the whole story, it doesn't really sort of fit anything that we do in other things like the Berlin crisis, for example, or like the conferences. This is just sort of, it happens, but it definitely plays its part in support and filling in everything else that was going on around this time, particularly the US paranoia. Okay, so again, apart from the rigged election, just one more thing on Czechoslovakia, we've got this huge communist victory. Okay, so all parties being banned, again, is another example of democracy being killed in Eastern Europe. That's 3 countries now where there is no other party but the Communist Party. This looks, as we keep saying, for all intents and purposes, a communist takeover. So just pause the video a little bit, looking at this source, and just write what you think is essentially going on, what this source is saying. Do you think it's a Western source? Do you think it's a Soviet source? Write your answer and then come back to the video when you're ready, and we'll have a little chat through that. Okay, so obviously, hopefully it's obvious to you that this is a Western source with Moscow in the background. We can see those Russian buildings, and essentially what they're doing is they're putting a lasso around Czechoslovakia and they're going to pull that in towards Moscow. You could change any of the names in this source to any of those countries that have fallen in the last couple of years, but that's the point, and that's the view from the West, that the Soviet Union is essentially one by one rounding up, like a cowboy would do with his rope, all of these countries. All right, so that being said, that's the majority of this lesson now sorted, how each country fell. Let's just bring it to a bit of a close, really. So we can see here this timeline, a bit of a summary. Just make sure your notes roughly match these things. You can see that I've talked a little bit more than perhaps you needed to have written, but this is the kind of detail that you might need to include in a little paragraph about the fall of the satellite states. All right, or the joining of the satellite states. Again, it'd be interesting to do for when the Cold War ends, how each country then leaves the satellite states one by one. So that is something that if we can be confident on both of these, I reckon that's probably the worst question they could ask. Something about the setting up of the satellite states and something about the fall of the satellite states. It's just a bit boring, really, when you think about all of the interesting topics that they could ask you about. So make sure that you are happy with that. Okay, so if you are Truman, what would you think about how each of these countries fell? Angry, annoyed, paranoid, worried, whatever it might be. Just, I know we've talked about that throughout this video, but just before you move on, formalize your thoughts into a document or however you're revising this, okay? So now we've got to think about, now we've done the content of it, how does it look for an exam paper? Could it be question 1 or question 3? But first of all, let's answer this question. Why did the West just sort of sit back and let it happen? Because obviously we've said all lesson, how does Truman feel? How does Truman feel? Why didn't he stop it? Why didn't he sort of do something more aggressive than just being paranoid or a bit worried? So the simple answer to that is that no country is in a position to go back to war. Now, obviously, that's a statement for European countries, definitely. They've been battered by the Nazis and by Blitzkrieg for years. Maybe you could argue America hadn't been quite so battered. But anyway, it was a significant loss of life and damage to them too. as they approach the end of World War II. So no one is in a position to go back to war. All right, the Red Army is already stationed in Eastern Europe, so they've got a heads up. They took out all the Nazis in all of these countries, so they're in a much stronger position in Eastern Europe to defend any possible attack that might come from the West. And at Yalta and Tehran, it was agreed, remember, that the Soviet Union should have some influence. That was always part of the agreement, certainly in the short term after the war, because they helped remove the Nazis. So in that sense, that third bullet point here is probably the most important reason as to why we didn't do anything, apart from tut a lot, be a little bit worried, a little bit anxious, a little bit paranoid. But they're the main reasons why we didn't do anything. Also, Stalin has claimed it was democracy, as communists got the popular votes in these Eastern European countries. Now, as we've seen in this lesson, that is not true. There was definitely influence, pressure, and some rigging, but arguably and technically there were elections, and democracy has sort of allowed communism to win. Obviously, that's going to upset the Americans because that's clearly not really the case. So that's why really nothing happened, and we watched these countries one by one fallen. I suppose America's big response during the fall of all these countries was the Truman Doctrine, and that was their way, I suppose, of threatening and warning America. I would imagine that if any other country now fell, now that he's got his buffer zone full with Czechoslovakia filling in the gap, it definitely would be harder to argue this was a defensive thing if he then, say, moved on to Italy and so on. So maybe that's Stalin's plan, was to get the buffer zone as it was all along, or maybe he actually was and would have done a lot more spreading west had it not been for the Truman Doctrine and America's threat. Don't forget, though, at this point, America's got a nuclear bomb, Russia hasn't. So again, that just is a little bit of context to the story that we're talking about here. So the consequences, clearly for question 1, give one consequence of the satellite states, or it could be question 3, how important were the satellite states for US-Soviet relations or development of the Cold War? The following are things we probably want to be thinking about, don't we? So Britain and America are alarmed by Stalin's actions. So if we're talking about relations, you're quite easily going to say and get a nice mark for this. One of the consequences of this was that the Grand Alliance began falling apart. Tensions rose, as we keep saying. They're worried, they're anxious, and this is Stalin's actions doing this. So we definitely want to get that point in for sure. Roosevelt and Churchill had agreed that Eastern Europe should be within a Soviet sphere of influence back in Yalta. So again, you could say that that's Stalin's argument, but again, we're talking about relations starting to be strained. This whole satellite state business, the gist of what you're arguing in question 1 or question 3 is the straining of relations. That's what this is doing. You know, we're not leading to a war, we're not leading to invasions, we're just talking about a straining of the Grand Alliance. They're also convinced that democratically elected governments friendly to the Soviet Union could be set up in each country, which is what's happened. So that has proven Churchill right. All of those reasons why Churchill was worried during the conferences during the war, it's happening. It's literally happening there and then. It's supporting the long telegram. But of course, Stalin's going to argue that, well, our telegram from Novikov says that you're building a massive army. Why would you need an army in peacetime? We have to defend ourselves. So that's kind of the gist of what's going on. And obviously, we've talked about that in the telegrams lesson. So again, relations being strained by these bullet points. Stalin believes he could only ensure support of Eastern European countries by setting up Soviet-controlled governments. That would be his argument. But again, what it looks like and what it is, you know, what's that saying? If it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, then it is a duck. Maybe that's an old-fashioned statement. That just basically means that what it looks like is actually what it is, and it looks like there's a communist spread across Europe. So all of these consequences so far, they all affect Soviet-US relations. That's the slant where I think this would be in your exam. The satellite states would be a question about US-Soviet relations or developing the Cold War. But that's the same thing, isn't it? Developing the Cold War is getting worse because their relations in the Grand Alliance are breaking down. Truman sees this as a blatant attempt by Stalin to spread communism. We know that. We've talked about that the whole lesson. This is going to be more of a thing, especially if this question is in some way linked to the Berlin crisis, the first Berlin crisis with the blockade into West Berlin. This is because of all of this tension in the build up to that. And that's, I suppose, the biggest challenge of the Cold War course is that you do need to step back sometimes and you do need to be aware of what's happening everywhere, because that affects decisions and events that happen elsewhere. And that's the hardest bit, because there's so much going on, but that's where timelines are good. Just create a big old timeline of where everything is, and then you can start to see where it all slots in. All right. Then, of course, as we started this lesson, we mentioned the Iron Curtain speech, which is suggested and aligns more with America. This has put Stalin on the back burner. He believes, once again, that he's being ganged up on by the West, as he's believed all along, as he believes in the first Berlin crisis, that they're always being ganged up on. The creation of Bisonia and Trisonia is further proof of that. It is absolutely, isn't it, tit for tat, very school playgroundy behavior from these people, but that is kind of what happened. So hopefully with this little screen now, you can start getting your head around maybe a question one consequence of the satellite states. You can easily get 4 marks out of this, but it's more likely going to be, I think, a question 3, how important was the satellite states for relations? Okay, and then the last thing, and what we want to be saying, is the word worsened and provocative. All those process words, all those tension words that we keep talking about for the narrative question. This is one example where there's no positive at all. It's very negative, but the Grand Alliance is hanging on by a thread, and that's something you might want to try and get your point across as well. All right, so just to finish really quickly, a little timeline of what's happened so far in the course. You can see that from the Grand Alliance joining in 1941, it has got significantly worse. So obviously, if we get freezing in this Cold War case, we're going to be hitting rock bottom. Chances are some sort of military response, but you can see just with that brief timeline where things are right now. As worse as they've been so far, it kind of was good ending the war together. Remember this marriage of convenience. They never liked each other anyway, but once Hitler was gone, it became very, very clear that they actually still hated each other. That's where we are in a little tension checker. Again, as always, out of our textbook that we use, a little summary of the story. Do the little checkpoint questions if you need to. If you're stuck, ask your teacher. And remember, all of these lessons are available on our website at stchistory.com. Hopefully by the time you visit, they'll all be recorded, but at the very least, they'll be there in a document if you just click the link. So this is definitely one of the more tricky topics of the Cold War course. A little bit of repetition perhaps as we've gone through this lesson, so I apologise for that, but hopefully it's been able to be helpful in the sense of just giving you a bit of an idea about how each country fell. The detail is less important how each country fell. It's more important that you understand the impact that had on relations and the development of the war. All right, if you do have any questions, obviously, about this topic or any others, please just let your teacher know, and we will see you for the next video very shortly. Thank you very much, and goodbye.